The Canadian Grenadier Guards is a reserve infantry regiment in the 34 Canadian Brigade Group, 2nd Canadian Division of the Canadian Army. The regiment is the second most senior and oldest infantry regiment in the primary reserve of the Canadian Army, located in Montreal. Its primary role is the provision of combat-ready troops in support of Canadian regular infantry. However, as it is also a household regiment, it performs similar ceremonial duties to the Guards regiments of the British Army, which primarily entails mounting the guard on Parliament Hill and at Rideau Hall in Ottawa, a task it shares with Canada's other household infantry regiment, the Governor-General's Foot Guards. The Canadian Grenadier Guards is an allied regiment to the British Grenadier Guards lineage. The Canadian Grenadier Guards originated in Montreal, Quebec on 17 November 1859 as the 1st Battalion Volunteer Militia Rifles of Canada. It was redesignated as the 1st Regiment of Volunteer Rifles of Canadian Militia on 7 September 1860. On 2 May 1898 it amalgamated with the 6th Battalion Fusiliers and was redesignated the 1st Battalion Prince of Wales as Regiment Fusiliers. It was redesignated as the 1st Regiment Prince of Wales's Fusiliers on 8 May 1900, as the 1st Regiment Canadian Grenadier Guards on 29 December 1911, as the Canadian Grenadier Guards on 29 March 1920, as the 2nd Battalion. The Canadian Grenadier Guards on 7 November 1941, as the Canadian Grenadier Guards on 15 February 1946, as the Canadian Grenadier Guards on 1 September 1954, before reverting to the Canadian Grenadier Guards on 1 August 1976. The 6th Battalion Fusiliers originated in Montreal, Quebec on 31 January 1862 as the 6th Battalion Volunteer Militia Rifles, Canada. It was redesignated as the 6th Battalion Volunteer Militia, Canada, or Hochelaga Light Infantry on 5 June 1863, as the 6th Battalion Hochelaga Fusiliers on 3 December 1875, and finally as the 6th Battalion Fusiliers on 28 January 1876. On 2 May 1898, it amalgamated with the 1st Regiment of Volunteer Rifles of Canadian Militia. Perpetuations. The War of 1812, 1st Militia Light Infantry Battalion, 2nd Battalion, Select Embodied Militia Corps of Canadian Voyages, Montreal Incorporated Volunteers, Montreal Militia Battalion, Provincial Commissariat Voyages, 1st Battalion, British Militia, the Great War 87th Battalion, CEF, 245th Battalion, CEF. Operational history. The Fenian Raids. The 1st Regiment of Volunteer Rifles of Canadian Militia was called out on active service on 8 March 1866 and served on the southeastern frontier until it was removed from active service on 31 March 1866. The 6th Battalion Volunteer Militia, Canada was called out on active service from 8 to 31 March and from 1 to 22 June 1866 and served on the southeastern frontier. The 1st Regiment of Volunteer Rifles of Canadian Militia was called out on active service on 24 May 1870 and served on the southeastern frontier until it was removed from active service on 31 May 1870. The 6th Battalion Volunteer Militia, Canada was called out on active service on 24 May 1870 and served on the southeastern frontier until it was removed from active service on 31 May 1870. Second Boer War. The regiment contributed volunteers for the Canadian contingents during the Second Boer War. The Great War. Details of the regiment were placed on active service on 6 August 1914 for local protection duties. The 87th Battalion, CEF, was authorized on the 22nd of December 1915 and embarked for Britain on the 23rd of April 1916. It disembarked in France on the 12th of August 1916, where it fought as part of the 11th Infantry Brigade, 4th Canadian Division in France and Flanders until the end of the war. The battalion was subsequently disbanded on the 30th of August 1920. The 245th Battalion, CEF, was authorized on the 15th of July 1916 and embarked for Britain on the 3rd of May 1917, where it was absorbed by the 23rd Reserve Battalion, CEF, on the 14th of May 1917 to provide reinforcements to the Canadian Corps in the field. The battalion was subsequently disbanded on the 17th of July 1917. The Second World War. The regiment mobilized the Canadian Grenadier Guards, CASF, on the 24th of May 1940. It was redesignated as the 1st Battalion, the Canadian Grenadier Guards, CASF, on the 7th of November 1940. It was converted to armor and redesignated as the 22nd Armored Regiment, CASF, on the 26th of January 1942 and as the 22nd Armored Regiment, RCAC, CASF, on the 2nd of August 1945. It embarked for Britain on the 25th of September 1942. On the 26th of July 1944, it landed in France as part of the 4th Armoured Brigade, 4th Canadian Armoured Division, and it continued to fight in northwest Europe until the end of the war. The Overseas Regiment was disbanded on the 15th of February 1946. On the 1st of June 1945, a second active force component of the regiment was mobilized for service in the Pacific Theatre of Operations as the 22nd Canadian Tank Battalion, CASF 6. It was redesignated as the 22nd Canadian Tank Battalion, RCAC, CASF, and was disbanded on the 1st of November 1945. Korean War in Afghanistan. The regiment contributed volunteers for the Canadian Task Force's contingents during the war in Afghanistan. History. Predecessor and Perpetuated units. The history of the Canadian Grenadier Guards parallels in many ways the evolution of Canada as a nation, beginning in the early days after the Treaty of Paris in 1763. On the 12th of March 1764, Colonel Frederic Haldimand ordered, from Trois-Rivières, Quebec, the formation of a volunteer unit to aid in the defense of Canada. In response, the 1st Company, District of Montreal Militia was raised. Under the command of Captain de Montezambert, the company was drawn from the traditional militia of the ancient regime, and was predominantly French-speaking. This company was raised in status to a battalion in 1807, becoming the 1st Battalion, Montreal Militia under the command of Lieutenant Colonel the Honourable James McGill, founder of McGill University. Elements of the 1st Battalion fought at the Battle of Chateauguay under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles de Salaberry. As a result of their conduct, the 1st Battalion was awarded a pair of colours after recommendation by the Commander-in-Chief, Sir George Prevost, to the Prince Regent. The Select Embodied Militia continued to exist after the War of 1812, being called upon next during the Rebellion of 1837. Various units existed as Montreal Rifles, Loyal Montreal Volunteers and later Montreal Volunteer Rifles. With the passage of the Militia Act in 1859, the Montreal Rifles became the 1st Battalion, Volunteer Militia Rifles of Canada on the 17th of November 1859. The 1st Volunteer Militia Battalion to be formed in the British Empire. In 1860, the unit was was raised to regimental status by the Prince of Wales with the title of First or Prince of Wales Regiment. The Volunteer Rifles of the Canadian Militia. Its regimental status was unique within the Canadian militia, highlighted by the regimental motto Nullis Secundus and its designation as the First Regiment. The Prince of Wales became the honorary colonel, an appointment he continued to hold after his coronation as King Edward VII in 1902. In addition to those directly antecedent to the 1st Regiment, the 6th Battalion, Volunteer Militia, was raised in 1862, which later became the 6th Battalion Hochelager Light Infantry and subsequently the 6th Battalion Fusiliers. In 1898, this battalion disbanded and absorbed into the 1st Regiment to become the 1st Battalion Prince of Wales Regiment Fusiliers, which then became the 1st Regiment Prince of Wales's Fusiliers in 1900. Lieutenant Colonel J. H. Burland, last commanding officer of the 6th Fusiliers, became the first honorary lieutenant colonel in 1904. During the period from 1859 to 1900, both the regiment and the 6th Fusiliers were on active service during the Fenian raids of 1866 and 1870, and the 1st Regiment was next for duty in Montreal at the time of the Northwest Rebellion in 1885, being encamped under arms for a month ready to go to the front, when the 1st South African contingent was formed as the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment. The 1st Regiment contributed its quota of officers and men to E Company. This contribution earned the Battle Honour South Africa 1899 to 1900, early 20th century and First World War. In 1911, Lieutenant Colonel J. W. Carson was asked to reorganize the regiment. He agreed on the conditions that he be given a free hand in the selection of his officers, that the regiment should be renamed and become a Regiment of Foot Guards while still preserving its identity as the 1st Regiment of the Active Militia of Canada, and that it should be provided with an armory of its own. The reorganization was promulgated in January 1912 when the 1st Regiment became 1st Regiment, the Grenadier Guards of Canada, and in April 1914 took possession of the new armory and changed its name again to 1st Regiment Canadian Grenadier Guards. It remained the 1st Regiment and was seen to be the Canadian unit of household troops for the Sovereign. Within a week of the declaration of the Great War, the regiment contributed the 1st commanding officer, 11 officers and 357 non-commissioned officers and men to the newly formed the Royal Montreal Regiment. Further contingents were provided to Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the 13th Battalion, the 23rd Battalion, 24th Battalion, 60th Battalion, and the 73rd Battalion, all of the CEF. Lieutenant Colonel Megan returned from overseas command of the 14th Battalion in June 1915 and announced in September that permission finally had been given to raise an overseas battalion of the regiment, the 87th Battalion CEF. Active recruiting began on the 23rd of October, and in 7 weeks the battalion was raised and ready for its winter training in barracks at Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec. The battalion was unique in that recruiting had occurred not only in Montreal but in every province of Canada. It was a thoroughly representative Canadian unit. Use of the title Canadian Grenadier Guards was also different, as the policy had been to not send CEF battalions overseas with the militia titles for the Canadian Grenadiers. A special authority was sought from His Excellency the Governor-General, HRH the Duke of Connaught, who as a British Grenadier authorized additionally the wearing of Grenadier Guards badges. The 87th Battalion entered France on the 12th of August 1916 and remained on the continent until 1919. During the war, it earned 17 honorary distinctions, and Private John Francis Young was awarded the Victoria Cross. After the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917, the increasing difficulty of finding replacements for the English-speaking battalions from Montreal became acute. Earlier, the regiment had raised a second CEF battalion, the 245th BN, which, although it had moved to England, did not fight as a unit, its personnel being used to support the 87th BN and the 1st BN of the CEF. Consequently, and to retain the Canadian Grenadiers in the order of battle, the decision was made to transfer the remaining personnel of the 60th BN to the 87th BN. On the 22nd of November 1918, King George V granted the title of Guardsman to private soldiers of the Brigade of Guards, and this distinction extended to the Canadian Grenadiers. Between the wars, on return to Canada in 1919, the 87th BN was demobilized. Its name was perpetuated by the 1st Battalion, the Canadian Grenadier Guards, in 1920. At the same time, the 2nd Battalion, Canadian Grenadier Guards, perpetuated the other Great War Battalion of the CEF. With this reorganization, the regiment lost the ordinal title of 1st Regiment, as numerals for all regiments were discarded. The return to peace permitted steps to be taken to enhance the status of the regiment as a regiment of foot guards. In 1924, HRH the Prince of Wales became the Colonel-in-Chief, and was able to inspect the regiment during a visit to Canada in 1927. In 1930, H.M. King George V approved the alliance with the Grenadier Guards, which linkage continues today. In 1932, he approved the use of a stand of foot guard colours, and of company colours within the regiment. In 1937, the Brigade of Canadian Guards was authorized, which brigade trooped in Ottawa on a number of occasions, not least for H.M. King George VI. During the royal visit in 1939, the brigade was inspected in England in November 1942 by Major General Phelan, who had commanded it in Ottawa in 1935. In addition to the continuing linkage with McGill University, a strong linkage grew with the St. George's Society of Montreal, one of the benevolent societies. St. George's supported the regiment in a number of ways. In return, the regiment paraded to the regimental church on the Sunday closest to St. George's Day, at the end of which service the regiment paraded past the president of the society and then received the society at home. This linkage continued well into the 1960s. Members of the society are still welcome in the Armory. Second World War. At the outbreak of the Second World War, the regiment furnished 20 officers and 125 other ranks to other units before its own mobilization in 1941 as 1st Battalion, the Canadian Grenadier Guards. It reached full strength in 3 weeks. It trained first on St. Helens Island in Montreal, moved subsequently to Camps Borden and Valcartier, garrisoned the Halifax Citadel, was stationed in St. John, New Brunswick, and trained in Sussex, New Brunswick and Ebert, Nova Scotia. On the 5th of February 1942, the 1st Battalion became 22nd Canadian Armoured Regiment, a unit of 4th Canadian Division. In September, proudly wearing the black beret of the Armoured Corps, 22 Car moved to England, where it would continue to train in a number of areas until deployed to Normandy on the 21st of July 1944. For that time until VE Day on the 8th of May 1945, 22 Car fought throughout the battles around Falaise, the move into Belgium and the Netherlands, and finally across the Rhine. earning 12 honorary distinctions. By this time, 22nd Canadian Tank Battalion had been raised for the Pacific Force, but the war in the Pacific ended before it could be deployed overseas. 22nd Canadian Armoured Regiment returned to Montreal in February 1946 for demobilization and gave up its tanks. The regiment's participation in the Second World War also saw numerous heroic actions by Sergeant Mohowitz, who did not survive the war. Post-Second World War, on formation of the 1st Battalion, the home station regiment became 2nd Battalion, the Canadian Grenadier Guards, which continued through the war the traditional role of the militia to provide reinforcements to units overseas. Reinforcements were drawn from other units, particularly the Halifax Rifles and Princess Louise's Fusiliers. On reorganization, the Canadian Grenadier Guards resumed its traditional militia role as a regiment of foot guards. Many of those who had served overseas continued to serve the regiment in Montreal. The peacetime routine of training, garrison duties and parades was highlighted by the appointment of King George VI as Colonel-in-Chief, the acceptance of the honorary colonelcy by F.M. the Viscount Alexander of Tunis, the opening by him of the Regimental Museum as a memorial to the fallen in 1950, and the participation by members of the regiment in Korea. With the formation of the Canadian Guards in 1953, the regiment became the 6th Battalion, under which title it received a new stand of colours from H.M. Queen Elizabeth, the Colonel-in-Chief, in 1959. Although the responsibility for public duties in Ottawa was assumed by the Canadian Guards, the regiment provided individuals for this purpose until the formation of the Ceremonial Guard in 1969. Since the date, no two company has participated in the changing of the Guard on Parliament Hill and Rideau Hall during the summer months. As a result, the city of Ottawa granted its freedom to the regiment in 1979. A similar grant was made by Montreal in 1990 in commemoration of 225 years of service to the city since the formation of 1st Company, District of Montreal Militia in 1764. Service to Canada and Montreal continues. Members of the regiment participated in aid to civil power at Oka and Kahnawake in the summer of 1990, and members have served with the United Nations Protection Force in the former Yugoslavia, as well as with the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force in the Middle East. Most recently, members have served with and in support of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. The Canadian name for that mission is Operation Athena. Battle Honours. The regiment has been awarded 35 battle honours, of which 23 are emblazoned upon the colours, and 1 honorary distinction. Battle honours in small capitals are for large operations and campaigns, and those in lowercase are for more specific battles. War of 1812 Defensive Canada 1812 to 1815 Defense du Canada, Chateauguay. The non-emblazonable honorary distinction Defense of Canada 1812 to 1815 Defense du Canada, Second Boer War South Africa 1899 to 1900. Great War Second World War in Afghanistan Victoria Cross recipients: Private John Francis Young, 87th Battalion, P. Canadian Expeditionary Force Duriaris Sector, 2 September 1918. Memorials: an M4 tank at Connaught Range and Primary Training Centre in Ottawa, Ontario was dedicated by the 22nd Canadian Armoured Regiment to the memory of its soldiers who fought in Northwest Europe from 1944 to 1945. Armoury. Order of Precedence. Alliances. United Kingdom Grenadier Guards.